Let's start with a confession. You're living in a universe with antibiotics, and you've probably never really cared. So let's open on a scene. You're in a hospital. The delivery room is dim, nurses are racing around, monitors are beeping. Your arrival is a bit rough, but you make it into the world. A few hours later, your temperature spikes. Your body goes into full, welcome infection mode. In today's world, what happens? Blood tests. A clear IV bag hooked up to your tiny arm, filled with a molecule whose name you'll never learn. A few days later, you're discharged. At family gatherings years later, this whole thing is reduced to one sentence. There were some complications after the birth, but it passed. Now rewind that scene. Same hospital, same you, same infection. One difference. In this universe, antibiotics were never discovered. This time there is no IV bag, just cold cloths, fever reducers, and a helpless family watching. The infection spreads into your blood. Your body turns into a slow, invisible fire. A few days later, this story ends with a tiny grave and a very short life. Same you, same starting point. What changes the ending is one question. Does this invisible technology called antibiotics exist or not? In this video, we're going to split the world into 3 timelines. The antibiotic world you live in right now, an alternative world where antibiotics were never discovered, and a post-antibiotic future where we, very cleverly, managed to lose them. In each one, we'll look at how you might be born, how you'd live, and what you'd be afraid of. By the end, whichever timeline bothers you the most, drop it in the comments. That's how this stops being a one-way lecture and turns into a tiny collective experiment. If you're ready, let's fire up the history engine. We're in the early 1900s. Life expectancy is almost laughably low. At the top of the death charts, you see the same usual suspects: pneumonia, tuberculosis, diarrheal diseases. Bacteria and viruses are basically speed-running humanity. There are no antibiotics yet. Birth is a serious risk. Childhood is a minefield. Surgery is full hardcore mode. Then, in 1928, someone steps onto the stage in London. Alexander Fleming. At St. Mary's Hospital, he walks back into his lab, looks at a petri dish, and notices a patch covered in mold. But this mold has cleared out the bacteria around it. He thinks, something is going on here, and gives the substance a name: penicillin. He doesn't change the world alone. In the late 1930s, Florey and Chain join the story and turn penicillin into something that can be injected and given intravenously. During World War II, the US and UK basically switch into penicillin factory mode. Among wounded soldiers and pneumonia patients, death rates drop hard. Then the dominoes start falling. From the 1950s to the 1970s, new antibiotic classes appear. C-sections, appendectomies, orthopedic surgeries. They move from death gamble to high risk but doable. Neonatal intensive care, cancer treatments, organ transplants. All of them lean on one assumption: if infection shows up, we can handle it. Infection deaths fall. Global life expectancy jumps by decades. And then comes humanity's classic mistake. When we're good at something, we overdo it. From the 1980s onward, antibiotics are everywhere. Unnecessary prescriptions, just-in-case pills for mild colds, growth promotion in livestock, treatments stopped halfway. Bacteria look at all this and basically say, okay, so the game just got serious. They evolve faster. Resistant strains appear. Some last resort antibiotics start failing. Experts start using a phrase that sounds like science fiction. A post-antibiotic age might be coming. On paper, it still says antibiotics available, but the bar is quietly emptying. If you're still here, you're clearly on the give me the details side. And details need an audience. If you like these dark but honest science stories, a simple like or share is basically a tiny dose of antibiotics for the algorithm. Now, let's drag the timeline over to a universe where antibiotics never existed. Same starting conditions, Same years, same wars, same cities. But in this universe, Fleming never notices that moldy dish, or penicillin gets written off as too toxic, and nobody follows up. Florey and Chain move on to other projects. The antibiotic revolution dies before it begins. World War II still happens, but there is no miracle drug at the front. Infected wounds, gangrene, pneumonia keep killing soldiers and civilians. From 1945 to 1970, doctors still operate. They still do C-sections. But infection risk can turn any surgery into a sudden game-over screen. Chemotherapy, which suppresses the immune system, barely becomes a thing. Organ transplants remain theoretically possible and practically almost non-existent. Even so, this world doesn't just sit down and wait to die. Vaccination, hygiene, sewage systems, quarantine protocols, all of that becomes much stricter, much earlier. And against bacteria, another character enters the stage much sooner. Bacteriophages, or phages. A phage is a virus that infects and kills bacteria. Bacteria mutate, phages mutate. Both sides are like living patches constantly updating. In this alternative world, some labs develop phage cocktails tailored to specific bacteria. But this is not a cheat code either. Different infections need different phage mixes. Production is expensive. Regulation is tough. Access is limited. So medicine doesn't collapse completely, but everyone is far more afraid of infection. Birth is risky. Childhood is risky. Surgery is risky. Travel is risky. Now let's slide to the third line, the shadow of today. The third timeline is exactly here. Your world. A civilization that discovered antibiotics, built modern medicine on top of them, then slowly started to weaken that foundation with its own hands. Picture an arrow sliding from left to right. On the left, you have the safe, antibiotic world. On the right, you have the infection risk of a world with no antibiotics. As resistance grows, the real world drifts along that arrow. That's what a post-antibiotic age really means. Antibiotics exist, but they don't work. So in practice, they're gone. Keep these three paths in your pocket. Now we're going into the levels. Level 1, 3 babies, 3 universes. Let's upgrade the opening birth scene. Now there aren't 1, but 3 babies on the stage. Baby 1 is born in the antibiotic world, catches an infection, gets antibiotics, spends a few days in the NICU, then goes home. Family summary. There were some complications, but it passed. Baby 2 is born in the world with no antibiotics, same infection, but no drug to hunt bacteria from the inside. Painkillers, fever meds, fluids, then the looming risk of sepsis, the body quietly handing itself over to that invisible fire. Baby 3 belongs to the post-antibiotic future. On paper, antibiotics exist, but the bug is resistant. Maybe a phage cocktail comes in as a new method. Maybe it's still experimental. Which country that baby is born in, which hospital, can completely change the odds. The numbers are clear. Antibiotics massively increase the number of babies who survive neonatal infections. Thinking of these 3 babies as 3 versions of you makes the simulation hit a lot closer to home. If you're already thinking, so which timeline am I closest to right now? That's exactly the kind of thought the comment section was built for. Level 2. A small injury, a big difference. It's a summer day. You're playing football. You slip while dribbling and absolutely destroy your knee on the ground. Or you're at home after a tooth extraction. In today's world, the script is boringly simple. The wound gets cleaned, maybe a few stitches, a short course of antibiotics, a few days of care, and that's it. It might not even qualify as a proper memory. In the antibiotic-free timeline, the exact same fall writes a totally different story. Bacteria enter through the cut. Over a few days, redness spreads, pain and fever kick in. Doctors clean the wound. They operate if needed, but they have nothing to hit the infection from inside. Worst case, they perform heavy surgery just to save the leg. And sepsis is always there, waiting in the wings. A simple tooth infection can quietly travel to your heart or your brain. In your world, that's rare. In a no-antibiotic universe, it's not rare enough. The background feeling of safety in your everyday life is actually wired into an invisible stockpile of drugs. Here's a small quest. If there was a moment in your life when you thought, "Good thing there were antibiotics," sharing that story in the comments turns this video from a monologue into a kind of shared case file. Level 3. Modern Medicines Control Z. In the antibiotic world, chemotherapy knocks down your immune system, but there's an antibiotic army ready in the background to keep infections under control. Organ transplants, intensive care, all those high-risk medical scenes lean on a backstage crew you almost never see. Antibiotics. In the antibiotic-free timeline, most of these scenes never get written. Chemotherapy is ultra-rare and incredibly risky. Organ transplants are almost non-existent. A lot of very sick ICU patients are lost to infection. Short version. If there are no antibiotics, half of modern medicine, the half that really saves lives, disappears. That sentence is worth keeping somewhere in your head. Because no matter what you do with this video, we keep circling around one quiet question. Which world am I helping to normalize? Now let's get out of the hospital and head to the kitchen. Level 4. The timeline on your plate. You're in a supermarket. Chicken, red meat, milk, yogurt, endless options. For a typical city dweller today, eating meat a few times a week is nothing special. In the antibiotic world, agriculture and livestock used antibiotics for years to prevent infections and boost growth. Herd losses dropped. Production skyrocketed. Prices went down. Side effect? Resistant bacteria spreading quietly in the background. In the antibiotic-free world, herds are much more fragile. One outbreak in a barn can mean serious losses. Meat and milk become expensive, sometimes even luxuries. Food supply chains get rocked again and again by farm outbreaks. So even the food on your plate is tied to which timeline you live in. If these invisible links between my dinner and global health are your kind of thing, sending this video to one other person is a pretty easy way of saying, by the way, that chicken is part of a much bigger story. Level 5. The Post-Antibiotic Future and the phage DLC. Imagine the 2050s. We discovered antibiotics, used them for decades, and then, thanks to misuse, a lot of bacterial species evolved resistance. A simple urinary tract infection isn't so simple anymore. Post-surgery infections become hospital nightmares. Some centers don't have a single effective last-line drug against particular bacteria. This is not a world where antibiotics never existed. This is a world where antibiotics exist, but don't work. Practically speaking, you're back in an antibiotic-free age. At this point, a new DLC drops into the story. Phages. Bacteriophages are viruses that infect and kill bacteria. Bacteria adapt, phages adapt. Phage cocktails that are constantly updated in labs could form a new defense line against highly resistant infections. But again, this is not a cheat code. Different bacteria need different cocktails. Production is complex. Regulations are hard. So in the future, phages probably won't be the single hero that replaces antibiotics. They're more like living weapons that might keep us in the game. Antibiotic resistance is already a live storyline. What happens in the next seasons depends partly on our behavior and partly on how smartly scientists play with tools like phages and other new treatments. If you're thinking, yeah, I'd watch the sequel to this, that's exactly where subscribing comes in. Because the next simulation might be about the future of phages, or a completely different, what if the world worked like this scenario. Now let's put the three worlds side by side and go to the final screen. In a world without antibiotics, every infection from birth onward is a roll of the dice. Medicine is slow, expensive, and limited. Cities are more spread out. Life runs slower. Science still has tools like vaccines, hygiene, and phages. but nothing as cheap and as widely usable as antibiotics. In the antibiotic world, there is an invisible skeleton carrying your life from start to finish. From birth to surgery, from cancer treatment to organ transplant, from cheap food to megacities, everything sits on top of that unseen infrastructure. In the post-antibiotic future, you see a civilization that rotted that skeleton with its own hands, yet is still trying to stay in the game with phages and other new tricks. The story isn't pure doom, but it's not exactly cozy either. What this simulation is really telling us is simple. Progress is not an automatic setting. Antibiotics, phages, all these invisible technologies are just tools. How we use them decides which timeline we slide into. Next time you take an antibiotic, you might catch yourself thinking, this isn't just a pill. It's a century of science, millions of lives, and a deal we made with future generations. How we honor that deal doesn't just depend on doctors and governments. It depends on us. Every video you like, share, comment on, and subscribe to is actually a tiny but real vote for what kind of world you want to treat as normal. So as you walk back into your antibiotic world and look at all the days you didn't get sick, are you really ready to see them a little differently from now on?